All right, good morning, everybody. I think we might as well get going here. Let's see, I'm Dan Schultz with the State Water Board Division of Water Rights, and I'm the host of this meeting. So let's see, I think everybody has the agenda, was sent out with the appointment. So we'll go ahead and kick it off with introductions and housekeeping. So as we've kind of found with the Teams meeting, it's very challenging to do for everybody to introduce themselves. So it's nice if you can put your name and affiliation, if you can tie that to your name and the chat in the people log, so that everybody knows who's here. But something I thought that would probably be good to start doing each meeting is to do introductions of anybody who is joining for the first time, since over the time that we've met in these meetings, most of us have been introduced to each other. But do we have any new people joining us today for the first time? If so, go ahead and raise your hand. Great, would you like to introduce yourself? Aaron?
Yeah, hi, my name is Aaron Heyman, and I am the Streamflow Enhancement Program Manager at the Wildlife Conservation Board. And so, yeah, my first time attending one of these meetings. I'm excited to be here.
Great, thank you. And let's see, Peter?
Hello, Peter Dreckmeyer. I'm the Policy Director for the Tuolumne River Trust.
And Ashley?
Hi, I'm Ashley Casey. I'm a Senior Engineer with the Sacramento Water Forum. Thank you for having me here.
Great, and Tina?
Hi, good morning. My name is Tina Lowe. I'm from the State Water Resources Control Board, Division of Water Quality in the Recycled Water and Desal Unit. Thank you for having me.
Byron?
Hi, good morning. My name is Byron Amerson. I'm a hydrologist and geomorphologist at Environmental Science Associates in Sacramento. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And looks like the last one is Christopher.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name's Chris O'Keefe, and I'm a fisheries biologist with CDFW, working in the cannabis program. And yeah, thanks for having me today.
Great, thank you, everybody. Is there anybody I missed? Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Dan Grigg. I'm an owner of Sear hydrographic company in Central California. Glad to be here.
Great. Anybody else? Okay, so not too much on the housekeeping side. Just a reminder that this meeting is recorded. So if folks can make sure to keep themselves on mute if you're not speaking. If you haven't introduced yourself yet and you come on to make a comment, ask a question, or present, please just introduce yourself briefly so that everybody knows who you are. And with that, we can go ahead and move to our next agenda item, which is the SEF updates from the technical team.
I guess I can jump in, Dan. I'm not sure who else from our team is on the call today. So I think that there isn't a ton of update, except the main thing that that we've been working on, which we'll probably agendize for our next quarterly call potentially, is we've been working on developing some diagrams and some flow charts that crosswalk the various aspects of SEF to different processes involving either planning or policy or regulatory. And so the idea here is to make it more clear how the different steps of SEF relate to different programs that agencies may be involved with, whether they be on the planning side or on the policy development or on the regulatory compliance side. And so we'll be developing some of those and sharing them with this group for feedback and input to see if those are useful in helping to helping to kind of show how SEF ties into various programs. So that's sort of a stay tuned for that at a future meeting. And I'm like, see if anybody else is on the call from our technical team that wants to add some additional updates on goings on. I'm not sure if Julie's on, wants to talk about some of them. latest. Go ahead.
I'm on, Eric.
Okay, go ahead.
This is Ted Grantham, everybody. Hi, Ted Grantham, UC Berkeley. I just wanted to let folks know that the members of the CEF technical team hosted a full-day workshop on the California Environmental Flows Framework at the San Juan Restoration Federation annual meeting a couple weeks ago. And we basically provided an overview of California Environmental Flows Framework, described some case study applications, and provided sort of overview and hands-on demonstration of some of the tools that have been developed to support implementation of the California Environmental Flows Framework. We also had a presentation by some folks at DFW to highlight the ways in which some of the tools and approaches in CEF are being implemented in their program. So it was attended by about 50 people, including state agency staff, tribal representatives, water district representatives, and academics. And we're hoping, now that we sort of developed this material for supporting these types of workshops, that we can find other opportunities to share sort of this work with other audiences, potentially at the California Bioassessment working group meeting in the fall, or others. So for folks on the call that would be interested in coordinating with our technical team to do sort of maybe a more in-depth tutorial on California Environmental Flows Framework, feel free to reach out.
And Dan, I was going to say maybe Julie or Jeanette could just talk about some of the work they'll be doing on updating the calculator and some of that work that's going to be coming up.
Sounds good.
Sure, this is Julie Zimmerman with the Nature Conservancy and part of the technical team as well. Yeah, so we put in a proposal to WCB to get some funding for work modeling actual flows statewide, and also to move the functional flows calculator from its current location. It's hosted on a UC Davis platform, but have that moved over to the Nature Conservancy's Natural Flows web app platform, and so that it'll be maintained, and then add some other metrics so that you can tell if you run an actual flow time series that may be altered, if the calculator can actually pick up the metrics correctly. Because sometimes if flow time series are too altered, the calculator can't calculate the metrics because it can't pick up the changes in the hydrograph if it's something that, the alteration is so severe that it may be aseasonal. So that was recommended for funding and will be discussed, I think, at the August WCB meeting. So we'll keep everybody posted on that work.
Great, thank you, Julie. So does anybody have any questions or comments? Let's see, Norman.
Thanks to the members of the tech team for that update. I wanted to ask, Julie, what you just said, an acronym that I'm not 100% sure on. You said WTD or WTB?
WCB, sorry. Aaron is actually, Aaron Heyman is going to talk about that funding source, I think, next as part of this call. So it's the Wildlife Conservation Board Stream Flow Enhancement Program.
Sounds good. And I wanted to ask Ted a question too, real briefly, if I could. Ted, on the Salmonid workshop presentation, since those are all mostly practitioners, I would assume, did you get any, back and forth or constructive feedback about the utility of the methods or the lack thereof, anything like that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I would say, because we're still in such a sort of early phase of implementation, I wouldn't say we got sort of a lot of feedback in terms of understanding sort of challenges or of sort of implementing the framework. At this point, I think there were a lot of folks there that where there were the flows framework was pretty new to them. I think there were a lot of questions around the modeling data, the predictions of the statewide model predictions of functional flow metrics that come up in any in many contexts, and so there was some good discussion around that. For folks who don't know that, we do now have a published paper as part of the a special issue on environmental flows and frontiers in environmental science. There's a couple other papers that folks on the technical team have also published that, if you haven't seen, are worth looking at, and those can be found on the CEF UC Davis website. And so some of the, I would say, challenges of using that model, we hope to sort of provide some opportunities for improvements with this next iteration of the work that Julie just described. But generally speaking, I would say there's really strong interest across this sort of practitioner group that was represented at the workshop, and hopefully sort of with this sort of at least initial introduction, we'll see more implementation that will allow us then to sort of kind of feed back into the process for maybe addressing some of the areas that need additional work or support tools.
Yeah, let me clarify that. I wasn't implying with my question that there are problems with the method. I was just asking, did anybody who actually does this in the field see anything? So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, no, I think, that's great. I guess I was just saying that there was a lot of sort of interest and excitement around the approach and how it might apply to their system, but I would say we didn't get a lot of sort of concrete feedback on sort of the experiences that people are having sort of in the field with implementation, because we're still at such an early phase.
Great. Thank you, Ted. Any other questions? All right, hearing none. So we can go ahead and move on to our next agenda item, which is a presentation on the Wildlife Conservation Board Streamflow Enhancement Grant Program. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Aaron Heyman.
Thanks very much. Let's see here. I'm going to try to share my screen. So someone would be kind enough to let me know. Yeah, excellent. All right.
Yep, looks good.
So yeah, my name is Aaron Heyman, and as I said, I am the program manager for the Streamflow Enhancement Program at the Wildlife Conservation Board. And I'm excited to be able to present a little bit about the program and kind of talk about some of the intersections between Streamflow Enhancement Program that we run and the flows framework that you're all working on, because I think there are some cool intersections and overlaps. So I kind of want to just go over some, sort of program overview, program information, talk about a little bit of funding source information and where our money comes from and where it's supposed to go, discuss our application process a little bit and kind of how you or anyone else might try to get this money, talk a little bit about the types of applicants that seem to be common who are going after our funding and the kinds of projects that they bring. And then, like I said, take some time to talk about the intersections between the Streamflow Enhancement Program and the flows framework. So with that, just jump right into it. At the Wildlife Conservation Board, the Streamflow Enhancement Program was established in 2015, basically after the passage of Proposition 1, which was a California bond I'll talk about in just a minute. And we made our first awards in 2016. And the program's mission and the legislation that has given us funding all has this sort of idea of stream flow enhancement in some form or other. And so what we've really sort of gelled on and codified that as a working definition that we use is this. It's a change in the amount, timing, or quality of the water flowing down a stream or a portion of the stream to the benefit of fish and wildlife. So that's kind of the lens that we look through when we're selecting projects, when we're discussing the program and how it fits with other programs, all that kind of stuff. This is what we mean by stream flow enhancement. We have the ability to fund several different types of projects, so planning projects, things that involve engineering designs or permitting that will lead to an on-the-ground implementation project. We can fund scientific studies, though scientific studies with a focus on streamflow enhancement in some form, where the results will sort of inform some aspect, whether it's a practical application directly tied to a particular project, or like a large modeling, sort of conceptual idea. Those are all fine, but they've all got to sort of have some significant focus on streamflow enhancement. We fund acquisition projects, and this can include the acquisition of land and its accompanying water rights, or the straight up acquisition of a water right independent of a purchase of property. But again, land or land and water, all associated with enhancing stream flow in some significant way. And then, of course, we fund implementation projects. And these can be things like the construction of storage tanks where water can be pulled out of a stream during high flow, stored, and then released into the stream during low flow seasons. This can be the funding of structural irrigation efficiency improvements on working lands. This can be the installation of like sort of stream channel modifiers, large woody debris, that kind of thing, to improve habitat within a stream. All that kind of thing falls under the implementation umbrella. To date, the program has awarded 129 different projects across the state. And here's sort of the breakdown, about 50-ish planning, about 50-ish implementation. Those are sort of the two big categories. Fewer scientific studies, and then much fewer acquisition projects. And then this plus current solicitation is an indicator that all these numbers are in the process of increasing, because a few months ago we wrapped up our most recent solicitation where projects were proposed to the Streamflow Enhancement Program. They were reviewed and scored, and a selection committee met and kind of proposed a subset of the projects that were proposed for actual funding. Those are going to be taken to our board over the next few board meetings, over the next basically year. And as those are approved by our board, these numbers will all hopefully shift upwards a little bit. And as you can see, it's a statewide program. We've got a pretty decent spattering of projects all across the state. One distinct lack of projects is Southern California. We've definitely had some struggles with connecting the funding priorities that we have with projects in Southern California. So if anybody has any creative ideas for cool Southern California streamflow enhancement projects, very, very interested to hear about them. And we've taken some steps to sort of enhance our Southern California impact, including highlighting that actually as a funding priority in our most recent solicitation. And even when we said, right up in front, it's like one of the top 3 things we want, projects from Southern California, we still only got a very limited number of applications from the southern part of the state. So when it comes to funding, the sort of thing that makes us important and significant and let's do anything, are really from 2 different sources of funding. The first one was Proposition 1, passed by voters in 2014. This is a bond that allocated $200 million to the Wildlife Conservation Board to fund projects that would result in enhanced stream flow to the benefit of fish and wildlife. Statewide granting program, and Proposition 1 really specified kind of how the project was to be selected, and it specifically highlighted this sort of competitive selection process. And so that's really what we've been running from 2015-16 up until today. This very locked in annual cycle where we open up a solicitation cycle in late summer, early fall, accept proposals, sort of take those proposals off into a back room, review them, score them, and then meet with a selection panel to develop our final recommendations that we then all at once bring to the board and have them either approved or denied. This, however, is changing in some fun ways because of new money that we've gotten So in 2021, so just last year, the state budget, the governor's budget, included general fund money for stream flow enhancement projects through the Wildlife Conservation Board. And in particular, the state budget allocated $100 million for projects that enhance in-stream flow for the purposes of protecting fish and wildlife. So again, very sort of similar mission statements here. Again, statewide program. And the funding priorities for this one are still kind of being developed. We're still trying to connect how we want to use this general fund because we've got some more flexibility on how we go about that. And this flexibility will come out a couple more places in my presentation. But it really means that we have this sort of largest chunk of money and some more freedom on how to use it. And so we're really curious to go out and cast a kind of wide net. And this is actually where I have a request to everyone on this call. If you have or know of or sort of conceptualized, kind of thought of a kind of ambitious, kind of big project that has a pretty direct link to streamflow enhancement. Maybe it's a large property acquisition or a large water right acquisition that goes along with the property acquisition. That would really be best, sort of our highest priority targets. But major habitat restoration, just major changes to a waterway that would dramatically increase the ecological benefits and processes, and that's in that waterway. We want to hear about them. So please come and talk to us. If you've got something that maybe you've been thinking about for a while or hearing about, but gosh, it's such a big project, we're not really sure that you've ever been able to put together a funding source for it. You know, we've got this big chunk of money now. We want to hear about those big projects. We're open to them. So please, if you can think about this over the next few months, couple of years, and something comes to mind, please keep us in mind and let us know. The application process has changed actually quite recently. So that's why it says new up here. We're very excited about this change. This will alter that sort of locked in annual cycle that I talked about that was specified by Proposition 1 into something that more mimics what most of the other WCB grant programs do. And in fact, we've really sort of all the grant program managers kind of joined together to try to form a more streamlined application process. So the way it was in the past is we have about 15 or 16 different sources of funding, different grant programs at the Wildlife Conservation Board. And in the past, each program had its own application process. And so if you wanted to apply to any of them, you kind of have to research all of them and figure out which ones fit with your project, and then figure out what that application process looked like, and then go through that process, or maybe several of those processes, to try to see where you could connect with funding for your project. Now we're really going to try to streamline all of that. And we have one universal pre-application. You can find it on our website, which I'll have linked at the end of my presentation. You can go to the website, you can find this pre-application. It's sort of a short concept proposal kind of level. You put it in, and it is then distributed to all of the program managers. We can all look at it on the backside. You don't have to do anything. We read through it and we see which program we think it fits best with. And then maybe one or two of the program managers will reach out to you and say, all right, let's have a further conversation. So WCB staff will assign those programs and then reach out to you. And then if they do that, we can develop sort of more project consultation meetings and kind of have a more active role in how we would recommend maybe putting the project together to make it most competitive for the funding source that we have in mind, give you some advice, sort of help you take all the tools that you can get, put them together into a full application that you would then submit to the program that we sort of are recommending and identifying, which will hopefully smooth the process out quite a bit for everybody. And the other big difference of this whole application process is it's not linked to any opening and closing deadlines in an annual cycle. Now it's going to be a continuous process where when you're ready, when you have an idea, put that pre-application in, starts the process. You can do it 365 days out of the year. So we're really excited about this new process. We're really hoping that it allows us more flexibility and also more opportunity to engage with you and applicants to kind of craft the best applications and the best projects that we possibly can, kind of compromising between what people want to do and what the funding allows us to do. And the applicants that we work with are a pretty wide range. Eligible applicants include public agencies. They include nonprofit organizations, public utilities, tribes, mutual water companies, and also, so those are true of Proposition 1 and this general fund money, all of those. This last one is an addition just for the general fund money of private landowners who can now actually directly apply themselves for funding from WCB, from this general fund money. And they bring, like I said, you talked about all the different types of projects that we can fund. They bring all of these types of applicants, bring all of the diversity of types of projects to us. And then, getting into the more direct interactions and intersections between the Streamflow Enhancement Program and the California Environmental Flows Framework. We have funded a couple of projects that help to establish ecological flows, and also one in our most recent round of funding that's going to model actual flows. So we've definitely put some money into the program, and we're really excited by the framework and all its possibilities. And I think that there are some really great overlaps with how we could take, especially these two different projects. What are the ecological flows that should be, ideally flowing through a waterway, and what is its actual flows? And by looking at a kind of statewide range, find areas where you really need to prioritize work on this to make sure that those actual flows meet the ecological flow requirements. And this can be, in the form of low flows, improving ecological impacts, and also benefiting listed species. And even beyond that, part of the definition of streamflow enhancement that we're using is enhancing a waterway or a portion of a waterway. And also the timing, right? That's part of it, is the volume, the quality, but also the timing of flows. So this means there are lots of different sort of components of a flow regime that I think results in information that the framework could generate would directly inform. The seasonality of when flows need to come, what ecological processes and ecosystem processes need to be maintained in a waterway, and what flows are required to make that happen. And again, which parts of a flow, which component of a flow regime is most needed to benefit a particular listed species or set of listed species. I think all of that is starting to be, and also can be, a great deal more a great spot where the framework and the Streamflow Enhancement Program can really work together to get the best information and sort of develop the best projects. And there's definitely need for this. This last bullet about informing project design was sort of highlighted for me just recently when I actually had a consultation meeting with a group that was looking at a stream where there was an endangered species of fish, and they wanted to improve the stream habitat for this fish. And one of the things that they said in the sort of early consultation was that the goal would be to increase stream flow in this particular waterway so that this species of fish had the water flows that they needed at the times of year that they needed. But when I asked them, so how much flows are those? What times of year do they need them? What is that flow regime? They actually weren't quite sure. They didn't have that information kind of on hand. And that's a place where I think if they could work with or tap into the information that you generated as part of the framework, they could have that information on hand. They could build that into their project design so that it wouldn't just be, oh, we want to make this better, but hey, we want to make this better, and here's exactly what we need to make that happen, which I think would make everyone's projects much more robust. And I think is a really fertile ground for where the flows framework kind of information could directly influence and benefit streamflow enhancement program projects. So with that, I'm happy to open up to questions, talk with you about anything that I've covered, anything that I glossed over, anything that I missed entirely. And I'll just leave up here my information and my colleague Alyssa's information and the Streamflow Enhancement Program's website in case any of that proves useful to any of you. And I hope that you take it up and reach out with questions and project ideas and collaborations in the future. So thanks very much. And yeah, does anybody have any questions?
Great, thank you, Aaron. So I will call on folks. Let's see, Eric.
Excellent.
Yeah, hi, Aaron. Eric Stein here. Thanks for that. That was super helpful to hear. My question has to do with, has WCB contemplated on the back end? So once these projects are funded and implemented, how is sort of performance of these projects, or how might performance of these projects be evaluated, on the back end to determine not only sort of what was obtained for the money invested, but also more importantly, probably what worked, what didn't work, how can we continually improve the process of what we're doing in terms of streamflow enhancement by learning from these past examples. Has there been any thought put into mechanisms, for that feedback and how that might tie into CEF, which I think has some really nice bridges to help inform that type of analysis? Has there been any discussion along those lines?
Yeah, great question, and absolutely. So every one of our implementation projects has, as a component of the grant agreement, the requirement that the grantee develop some kind of performance monitoring plan. And so that should extend for the useful life of the project. And for Proposition 1, that's 20 years. For the general fund, it looks like it's probably going to be 25 years. So for an extended period of time after the grant closes, the funding may last 3-4 years, something like that. After the funding is done, what happens afterwards? Well, there's this management and monitoring plan in place that specifically lays out what the grantee's responsibilities are as far as going out, collecting data, confirming that the project, is still there doing what it was supposed to do. And then on top of that, WCB has its own monitoring program where we go out, and not just Streamflow, but across all of our funding programs, we go out and check up on all of our projects, particularly implementation projects. So again, make sure that the programs and projects are kind of doing what they originally said they would do, that they're fulfilling their long-term management requirements, stuff like that. Now, one thing that I think you brought up, which is an interesting one, and I'm not sure we specifically have a mechanism in place, is how to get that information to CEFF or other, similar programs. I mean, we certainly make a lot of our reports and a lot of the long-term monitoring reports that our grantees do publicly available, but that still kind of leaves it on other parties to go and harvest that data somehow.
Yeah,
that's worth thinking through.
Yeah, so I'll just leave it as, Danny, I know this is something we've talked about many times in the CEF team, right, is there seems like there's some good opportunities for partnership, because it would be great to create some consistency to how projects are evaluated and some mechanism where that data could get back to, a website, whether it's CDFW or the Water Board, so that that information is available to the public and to future practitioners and other folks like that. So I think that's something it'd be great to pursue, some ideas of how we could, move in that direction.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, it sounds good. Next question is from Greg.
Hi, Greg Reese with the Institute and the Moon Lake Committee. I saw you, it looked like you were showing listed species would be a priority. In a case where there aren't listed species, how does that fit with your priorities?
Yeah, so it would depend kind of on a lot of other factors. I mean, listed species are one of several different priorities that we have. Non-listed anadromous species, for example, are certainly a high priority thing to fund. And then, depending on what kind of ecological function or geographic area you're operating in, or kind of type of project that you're proposing, those can all sort of factor in and still make a project very competitive, even if there isn't a direct listed species sort of connection.
All right, next up is Conrad.
Hi, yeah, thank you for this presentation. It's very good. I just wanted to, maybe I've spoken to Wildlife Conservation Board about this already. I just wanted to respond to the first question that came after the presentation about measuring effectiveness. I was part of an effort several years ago that produced a report called Measuring Cost Effectiveness of Environmental Water Transactions. It basically created a metric by an economist who works in this realm to measure effectiveness of environmental water transactions, just as the title says. The conclusion back then was essentially most EWTs in California are not collecting the data necessary to actually measure effectiveness, and the hardest part was actually measuring whether or not, or the extent to which spending money on a transaction results in more water in stream. The only place the metric could be applied was Oregon. I think things have gotten better since then, but I just wanted to say that is out there, and I would love anyone who wants to help collaborate to either use that metric or apply something like it. So that's in part to make sure we're effectively using taxpayer money, but also to avoid harm, because some transactions conducted with money earmarked to help fish actually harms fish because it creates new infrastructure that results in increased diversions in areas that do not have in-stream flow requirements or enforcement. So I'll be quiet there. I just thought that since that question came, I should put it out there. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, thanks, Conrad. I definitely think there's sort of a couple ways of tackling this kind of thing. I mean, cost effectiveness is definitely important. I think there might be value though in, hang the cost, hang the expense. Just is it effective? Is a project effective? That's another useful metric that could be gone after as well.
Yeah, and I think cost effectiveness leads people astray. It's also just straight up measuring how much water do the fish get, if any, or is it negative? So putting the money aside, we first need to start with, and the author of this report said we need to walk before we run, meaning at the very least, we need to know if we are getting water at all for our money or if we are reducing in-stream flows for our money. So, and we haven't gotten even to that point on a lot of projects.
Right.
Thank you, Conrad. And there was a request in chat. If you have a link to the document, if you could please share. So next up is Norman.
Aaron, thank you very much for that presentation. It was very informative. I guess that first question that Eric asked about the monitoring that takes place when first of all, I am really glad to hear that there are requirements in this funding process for that, because I do think that's been neglected a lot. But also, assessing performance is sort of a long-term endeavor, and if you don't have good baseline data, it's hard to know if you're being effective. Not only from, is there water in the stream, as Conrad was just asking, but are there changes in the biological community in any measurable way? So is there any way here that in this program, if you have a stream that appears to be degraded by some metric already out there, that you could gather more information, on more detailed sampling on benthics or something like that to establish more of a baseline?
Yeah, so with those, there are kind of two components to this, I think, at least they come to mind immediately. One is that for implementation projects, one of the components of those monitoring plans almost by definition kind of requires that they set some kind of baseline at the beginning of their project, so that we know, have they made the increases that they wanted to, have the whatever fish populations or bird populations benefited and responded in the way that was hoped for by this project. So monitoring plans include some baseline data. The other thing is that many, if not most, planning projects, with an eye towards going to implementation someday, have a direct baseline monitoring component. It's one of the big things that we fund. are things like resource surveys, biological surveys at the beginning to establish exactly what you're talking about. Establish a nice solid baseline on a bunch of different metrics, cultural resources, biological resources, the works. So that when that project plan is developed into, sort of the 100% finished design and can then be implemented, we know where we started.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Definitely.
Anne-Marie?
Yeah, I was just curious if you could speak a little bit about the bounds and limitations you have on the grants that are available for individual, for private parties.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and that is very much an active subject of development right now. We were a little bit surprised when that general fund language came out that included individual parties, individual landowners, and so we're taking some time to kind of explore exactly what that does mean. Because I mean, a concern that I have certainly is that, and I mean no disrespect to any landowner anywhere, but anytime that money is sort of going out of the public sphere, there is a opportunity for not quite honest behavior. And so I think having some safeguards in place just to make sure that we're all on the up and up is worth doing. But figuring out exactly how that can be done effectively and sort of openly and transparently is definitely something we're working on. I definitely think that the kinds of projects that are going to be competitive in this kind of realm from a individual private landowner are going to be things that involve sort of trackable permanent change. If someone wants to sell their property, but they need some help with getting it valued, or maybe the actual transaction costs themselves, like maybe that's something where then the sale of the property can be something as a very permanent form of record. Water rights as well. If somebody wanted to, if a private landowner was interested in dedicating a chunk of their water to in-stream flow in a permanent fashion and maybe even protected by a conservation easement, those can be kind of expensive processes to develop. And if they wanted to come to us and use funding from us to get that done, I think that probably would be a fairly competitive proposal. And again, it interacts with many other state agencies, maybe even federal agencies at times. So it sort of has these built-in mechanisms for accountability.
Thank you.
But really, I mean, I think the door is pretty open. I think there's a lot of possible ways that we could interact with landowners. That sort of acquisition dedication is the first one that comes to mind for me, and kind of the most compelling, I think. But I'm sure there are others that I'm not thinking of right now.
Okay, thank you.
Question. Yep, next question is from Nick.
Hey, Aaron, this is Nick from Friends of the Shasta. Thanks for the presentation. I had a question about acquisition as it relates to water rights and how that process might get started with respect to simple purchase of a water right in its entirety, but not property.
Yeah, so that's a good question. One of the things that we have to deal with from an acquisition standpoint is that we have to go through, it's called the DGS appraisal process. Department of General Services, it's a state agency, kind of has to oversee and approve the value of acquisitions made with state money. And their processes are not quite flexible enough to really deal with water in an efficient manner. So I think to start the process off, if you were looking at a water rights, I think that the best thing to do to kind of smooth the process out is right from the outset, talk about the acquisition of a water right combined with maybe property, but if you can't do property, maybe some kind of conservation easement. Because that, by pairing with even an easement, that brings it into a process the DGS appraisal is going to recognize and be able to work with and be able to be pretty effective with. So I think that'll speed up and sort of smooth out the process for all of these, the more and more, if we can do that, if we can really pair a dedication with an easement of some kind to sort of help with the appraisal process. So that's where I'd start.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that.
All right, so it looks like Emery, you still have your hand up. Did you have another question? Or is it just a residual?
No, sorry. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you, Aaron, for coming and presenting to us today. It's been it was very beneficial, I think, to have you here. And if you'd like to continue coming to this meeting, I'll send you a link to sign up so that you'll have that information and get the meetings on your calendar and stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And yeah, I'd love to participate in the future.
Great. So let's see, next on our agenda is just a short break before we jump into our next presentation. So we'll take a 5-minute break. So let's be back at 10:56. All right, so we can go ahead and start back up here. So let's see, our next agenda item is a presentation on the Senate Bill 19 Stream Engaging Plan update with Valerie Zimmer. Valerie, are you on?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Okay, great. You can go ahead and take control.
Okay. Okay. Nope, that's not what I want to do. Can you all see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, so this is a presentation. We're getting ready for a public meeting at some point in time. So apologies for the non-specific slide here. We're not actually, this is not the public meeting, but this is the an overly technical version of that. And so I'll go through, I think, what's interesting to this group. I might not talk as much about some of the background stuff. I think most of the people in this group are somewhat familiar with SB 19. But very briefly, you know, SB 19, just a quick overview. We have it was a multi-agency effort. We have folks from DWR, the Water Board, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the California Geologic Survey. And the group that you see here, that's the core team. There were other folks that have contributed in one way or another to this project over time. So there were actually lots of people that were contributing a little bit here and a little bit there and offering help on this project. Just a quick overview. I'll probably talk about, you know, a little bit of the background, and I'm going to focus more on the gap analysis and the prioritization process of this project and what are the recommendations. So why are we doing this? I think this group probably understands that pretty well. We need more stream gauges to manage water. If 6% of our watersheds have no stream gauge, how are we to manage these watersheds in an effective way? And so, you know, in most of these ungauged watersheds, they have surface water diversion. So from the State Water Board's point of view, you know, we don't have any real monitoring for those watersheds. So it's a Senate bill. I'm going to kind of just go through this real fast. We also have a TAC, a Technical Advisory Committee, that, you know, is a bunch of folks from, we hope, a wide spectrum of water interest groups to advise the core team. The idea was that these people would coordinate with some of the others that they talk to sort of gather more input on their interests and what they think about the project. So they've all been really helpful, and they've provided a lot of very useful feedback over the past year and a half. And so we're very grateful to have that input from all of these other folks. So what are we doing exactly? One is we're writing a stream gauging plan. So this is really important. We were tasked to write a plan. In that plan, we were asked to identify priority watersheds based on a set of management criteria. So where should the new stream gauges go? We were asked to identify existing gauge or gauge sites that need upgrades and reactivation. So they specifically wanted us to look at upgrading and reactivating sites, old sites. And then there were other questions about data management, funding, collaboration, new technologies, et cetera. So these things are addressed in the report, some of them in depth and some of them in less depth. And then we're working on data visualization. Right now, we're working on a GIS tool. At some point, I want to pivot to an Internet of Water tool. The Internet of Water is an organization that is supporting basically water data transparency and visualizations and just trying to do a better job of us sharing our data. So I'd like to have a tool over at their site. We are not installing gauges, just to make that clear. We don't have any funding to install gauges. What we hope is that this plan will support future funding requests and maybe will result in more gauges getting installed in the long run. Okay, so what are the management criteria? the bill says that they would like us to look at placing or modernizing and reactivating stream gauges where lack of data contributes to conflicts in water management. And then the multiple benefits that were defined include, but are not limited to, water supply management, flood management, water quality management, ecosystem management, and reference gauges. So these pictures kind of represent those 4 areas. There was other text in the document talking about groundwater and temperature and other things. So there were sort of cannabis, I believe. So there are related priorities, but these are the sort of the core priorities that we looked at, and we sort of folded everything else into those other priorities. Now this is a lot, right? This is kind of everything in California. So how do you write a plan that does everything? Well, the first thing we had to do was do a gauge inventory in the state, and this is much harder than it should be. We limited ourselves to databases that were accessible to everyone and that we could query pretty easily. And so that's basically the USGS, CDEC, which is DWR, and we also looked at the Water Data Library, which is also DWR, but generally not their telemetered real-time gauges. And we excluded third-party gauges from other databases because we just didn't have the resources to look for gauges from lots of different sources. But keep in mind that there are more gauges in California. And so our gauge count is about 1,200 inactive gauges and roughly 1,000 active gauges. We defined active high quality as gauges that were real time, had, basically were telemetered, had flow and stage, and relatively regular operation, no intermittent sampling sites. The active limited use gauges are also pretty high quality. They just generally are not in real time, or maybe they're stage only or flow only gauges. Usually stage only, because flow only tend to be outlets from the dam. Inactive gauges were gauges that we considered to be, they were at one point real gauges, and they may be eligible for reactivation. And then we excluded gauges that were not classified as active for the analysis. In other words, they were never really active gauges. I think I need to change that. They were potentially just sampling sites, intermittent sampling sites, or peak flow sites, that kind of thing. That's not a real gauge. Or they were not eligible for reactivation or upgrade. So we basically excluded gauges that were on infrastructure or that were calculated, combined gauges, that sort of thing. Anyway, this is our inventory. Lots of pre-processing was required to get to this. So that is a problem that has been flagged. USGS and CDEC only. Okay, so the next thing we had to do was look at where are the gauge gaps? And so we ended up using a tool developed by UC Berkeley called the Stream Network Analysis for Gauges. This is very, very similar to the Nature Conservancy's gauge gap analysis tool. It uses roughly the same methodology. The difference is that this particular tool is written in R, which means we can customize it. We can swap out the flow lines data set. We can swap out the gauge data set. And so with the idea being that hopefully we can continue to update this over time as we get more gauges and better information. So it's basically the same thing. And what you see is that in the state, we have areas that are considered well gauged. It's based on watershed area, which is really pretty simple. And so as your gauge has a particular watershed area, if it's 100 square kilometers of watershed at your gauge, then we move upstream along the stream until we hit 50 square kilometers or 50%. And at that point, upstream of that, it is no longer considered well gauged. Going downstream from the gauge, we consider the stream to be well gauged until we hit a watershed area of 150%. So for our gauge of 100 square kilometers, it's just 150 square kilometers. Pretty simple. There are more sophisticated methods that are statistical that you could use to do a gauge gap analysis. But in my opinion, that is a big project, and probably, maybe a master's student level or higher to really do that well, especially at the resolution that we needed to. So what you can see here is that most of the gauges, most of the well-gauged stream segments are sort of on main stem tributaries, right? These are pretty big watersheds, and most of the sort of the headwaters watersheds are not well gauged. So So how do we address that? And you can see the red here are areas that are inactive. So there are a lot of places that are that were formerly gauged that are no longer gauged. In order to do our prioritization, we had to come up with a way of summarizing these data. And so we looked at doing it at the HUC 12 level. And so on the left, you can see the proportion of the state that is well gauged. And on the right, there's a visualization of areas that need a gauge. And so most of the state needs a gauge, 86%. And again, 64% of the areas that are ungauged, like 0%, have surface water diversions in our State Water Board database. You zoom in on the gauge gap analysis, you know, you see, I'm sorry, this is, I didn't really want this to be, there we go. You can see that we have, again, more main stem bias. You can you see that there are some tributaries that used to have gauges that no longer do. I've bullseyed some of the best candidates for reactivation and upgrades, and roughly that means that that gauge has a you know, a substantial gauge history or covers a lot of space. And basically I've only allowed one per HUC 12. And some HUC 12s just don't have a great candidate because the gauge was only in for a year, for example. And you look at Marquess Creek, and what's interesting about this, as an example, is you can see the gauge that's way downstream in the watershed. Out the Russian River is to the west, and so that's on the, I think, left side of the graphic, and you see that there had been another gauge upstream. It's not bullseyes because it was only in operation for a little bit over a year, and also the well gauge proportion doesn't extend very far upstream. And that's because there are tributaries that come in. You can see to the north, there's Windsor Creek, and more substantially to the south, the Laguna de Santa Rosa, which is a huge watershed, comes in. So, you know, the drainage area changes too quickly for that gauge to cover most of Marquess Creek. And so Marquess Creek is basically ungauged. This is in the Russian River for most of its watershed right now. So I think the results work pretty well because that matches what we know. Right, and so at least 3/4 of the active gauges are in impaired watersheds. So we are basically looking at watersheds that have a lot of, you know, dams and agricultural activity in those watersheds. Okay, so we had to narrow down our criteria. We were asked to, you know, where are the top priorities for ecosystem? And there are lots and lots and lots of data sets. And so one of the major activities of the project was to sort of look at data sets and narrow them down so that they covered the range of what we thought was important and what the TAC told us was important without having too much redundancy. We didn't want to have the same thing over and over. And so we chose 3 data sets. One was the CDFW Areas of Conservation Emphasis Aquatic Biodiversity rank. So you can see areas of high biodiversity are darker. That's on the left. We looked at the Nature Conservancy's California Freshwater Blueprint. And we just basically use this data set as if it's in it, it gets a point, and if it's not in one of these watersheds, it doesn't get a point, because we are also operating under the thought that other people that have put together these data sets know a lot more than us. And so if they've decided that these areas are a priority, then they're the experts. And so that was chosen for contiguous areas. And then another area that we were interested in looking at was groundwater dependent ecosystems. And this has been a bit of a tricky data thing to get at because we don't have explicit maps as to exactly where they are. Nature Conservancy has put together a map called Natural Communities Commonly Associated with Groundwater, which looks at, I believe, wetlands and vegetation. And we just kind of added it together and looked at areas that had a lot of wetlands and vegetation relative to the area of the watershed. And this is why you get numbers over 100% because there were 2 data sets. But the thoughts that, you know, if you have a wetland and you have wetland vegetation, your chances are pretty high that you actually have a wetland in that area. And so you can see that there's lots on the coast, but a lot of those are tidal estuaries. But you also see a lot of mountain meadows in the Sierra Nevada that come out on that. And of course, the Central Valley. So how did we combine these data sets? Well, first of all, they had to be in the HUC 12 area. And so the TNC layer is not a HUC 12 layer. So we had to convert that to the HUC 12 layer, which is what I just talked about. So we had to choose our data sets. We had to generate a score at the HUC 12 level, and that means for between 0 and 1. This is how we dealt with that. Then we had to weight those data sets and add them together. And the weighting is you know, we'd like it to be just a value judgment. Oh, we value this over something else, but sometimes it was more driven by the nature of the data. Like some of the data sets had a lot of really low scoring values. And so, you know, a 0.2 plus a 1, the 0.2 isn't really going to show up in your total because it's too small. So sometimes the weighting was due to the nature of the data itself. But very simply, we just added them up and then we multiplied it by the proportion of the watershed needing a gauge. And so we, the combined score reflects the gauge gap analysis in it. And we also had to remove some areas that basically were lakes. You can see Lake Tahoe scores pretty highly because it is a HUC 12, but we are not going to be putting gauges in the middle of Lake Tahoe. And so we did have to remove some watersheds due to it's just impractical. So this was a pretty easy, I would say, prioritization because you have a really clear priority and a really clear spatial distribution. When you look at a biodiversity rank, like it's pretty clear where we would want to put a gauge. But even this is tricky because how do you summarize the data? How do you normalize it? How do you add the data sets together? You know, the groundwater dependent ecosystems layer, do we pin that to stream segments? Do we rank it by the total area in the HUC 12? Do we rank it by length? Do we normalize it? And so there were a lot of questions and decisions that went into this, even for the easy data sets. And again, wetlands is the example here. Watersheds outside of California, like how do you normalize that? We have more tricky prioritization rankings. And here's another example, water quality. Where do we put a gauge, right? On the right is a really nice graphic showing water quality for conductivity, nitrate, and turbidity, which I think we all would agree is important for some ecosystems. But are we putting a gauge where it's pristine, or are we putting a gauge where it's highly impaired? So the data itself is not telling us where the gauge needs to go. And so that's hard. The other really hard thing about water quality is which parameters we select, right? Water quality is sort of a very broad category. And I think, to be fair, it probably deserves its own analysis for something like this. You know, we've had to highly simplify it because there's a lot there. So the way that we got around this is we decided that folks that are doing water quality monitoring in a location are doing it in that location for a good reason. We don't have to know what the reason is. And so we looked at monitoring sites. That's the one on the right and the one on the left. And we chose bioassessment monitoring sites and water quality monitoring stations. And these are areas for temperature and dissolved oxygen only. The other question we had to ask again was this parameters question. And temperature is explicitly listed in SB 19, and so it was selected. And dissolved oxygen was always also selected. A lot of the other potential toxins are not directly caused by stream flow impairment. There may be concentration and dilution effects, but stream flow itself is not the problem. And so we tried to sort of focus on things that were directly affected by stream flow, that stream flow was causing. And temperature, you know, low stream flows are causing higher temperatures, I think is the way to sort of think about that. And so these are our 3 data sets for water quality. Move on to the next area, water supply management. Again, this was a big category because we had to look at surface water and groundwater because groundwater was specifically mentioned in the bill. And so the 3 data sets we chose for water supply management were surface water diversions, the CDFW in-stream flow requirements, and fully appropriated and adjudicated streams and basins. Now, some folks look at this and they say, well, you know, water supply aren't the big dams really what's important in California? And the answer is they are. That's true. But we also felt like the big dams were pretty well monitored. And, you know, they have, in terms of the dams themselves, right, the reservoirs themselves. The tricky part of it is the inflows to those reservoirs are maybe not well monitored, but we had a hard time figuring out where you exactly put a gauge upstream of reservoirs. And so again, we looked at the fully appropriated and adjudicated streams to sort of cover that, you know, where do we not have enough water to distribute, and then water rights. And we looked at locations. And the reason, again, we looked at locations was that in terms of a water management problem, it's hard to manage 150 small diverters in a watershed. It's easier. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's a little easier to deal with one single entity that's operating a large diversion. And so again, we didn't go with volume because if you just sort this by volume, you kind of get pointed toward large dams and large diversions in the delta, and I don't think that's very instructive for where actual management problems are. And again, there's a lot of gauges down there in the delta. So you can see in terms of surface water rights, this is a heat map. Folks may not realize this, but look at where all of the diversions really are. They're in pretty high. They're concentrated in small areas. The Russian River, the North Coast, the Delta, lots of diversions there. And so you can see why there might be a lot of action in the Russian River. Okay, so another tricky question, groundwater. And in particular, we wanted to support the water supply activity of flood managed aquifer recharge. So these are areas that are being flooded to provide water supply, groundwater in the future. And we were looking at how do we support that? This is pretty tough. But where exactly do we put a gauge for a flood MAR project? Probably upstream is the best place, but where upstream? So again, it's not really that clear. One thing that I noticed, and I should bring a graphic into this, was that the headwaters of most of these Central Valley areas, these basins, actually end at a dam. So you have, again, the dam question comes into play. So almost none of them extend beyond a dam in their headwaters. And so again, you're looking at some local floodings and some dam releases. And so possibly, local streams, local rainfall could come into play here. It's not perfect, but that's what we've got for now. And so again, we chose this soil agriculture groundwater banking index. Again, groundwater, one of the questions we were trying to ask ourselves is, well, where would you put a gauge to support groundwater? It has to be someplace where the gauge is useful. And so, sigma basins alone, I don't think are very insightful because, some of these basins may be very, very disconnected from surface water and the gauge isn't going to do much. So we looked at the soil agriculture groundwater banking index to look at areas that were suitable for flood. And then we, again, pulled another Nature Conservancy layer called the ICONS interconnected surface water layer and basically scored on a points system on their likelihood of with emphasis on areas that are connected. And so those watersheds score more highly. I thought I had a summary of this, but I don't, I'm sorry. And what you end up with is kind of a groundwater layer, a surface water layer, and then we put it all together, and I'll show you that later. For public safety and floods, DWR had a list of their ungated spillways. So these are basically reservoirs that fill and spill without any control, completely uncontrolled. So they're sort of subject to the whims of whatever's happening upstream. And then there were also high hazard dams that were unmonitored. There's no gauges. And so they gave us a layer on the left that was considered the highest priority. So it gets weighted twice as much as everything else. The other thing we looked at was sedimentation risk due to fire. Basically, areas that are likely to burn in the future. And when they do, if you should get a heavy rain, you have a safety problem because you might have a debris field that comes down the canyon. And we have seen this in the last few years in Southern California. I believe it was Montecito had a big landslide. And so the idea is that for one, we don't understand this risk very well. And so stream gauges in these watersheds will help set a baseline and help researchers understand this problem. And the other idea was that, if you should have a gauge in those areas, you may get a warning potentially. And then the last thing was FERO projects, forecast informed reservoir operations. Why is this not a water supply question? I think the answer to that is that, in terms of a water supply question, you just want to fill the reservoir, as quickly as you can. And so the real balance with FERO is doing that without causing a flood problem, without causing an excessive flood hazard. And so therefore we felt that the FERO operations were really a flood control problem, not a water supply problem. And so it was put into the safety hazard. And so in terms of this area, we know which watersheds are upstream. We don't know exactly where we want gauges. So we just decided to say we're going to support FERO projects and let the the folks that are operating those projects decide where they need gauges. The last thing we did was this reference gauge exercise. And so reference gauges are those that are, relatively unimpaired, and they're used for, estimating water supply in areas outside of their own watershed, often in their own watershed as well. But adjacent watersheds that are ungauged are important. Reference gauges are important for that. And so for a reference gauge to be useful, it has to be pretty close, because you don't want similar watersheds that are 400 miles apart, because the rainfall is really different, right? You may have different precipitation or climate. And so distance was heavily weighted. We looked at hydrology, and we gave that a weight of 20%. And so basically every watershed was assigned a hydrology by month. I think we looked at by month, and then we normalized it over the course of the year, so you get a pattern. This is very similar to what eFlows, I think, does. And then that was compared to gauges. And so we were looking for similar patterns, not volume amounts. We looked at flow direction, because water flowing north or water flowing south, even on the same ridge or east or west, may see very, very different hydrology due to either rainfall patterns or drying, sun, that kind of thing. And then drainage area, similar drainage areas we thought might be similar in terms of their response. And so the left is the current reference gauge network. We assigned 180 gauges as reference gauges under a very broad criteria of simply not having substantial upstream diversions. That was the main criteria for assigning these gauges. We could probably do better. And then we looked at pairing those gauges with each watershed and assigning a pairing score. Now, the other thing we had to look at was, is there anywhere in the watershed that you could put a gauge? If you were to say, hey, this watershed needs a gauge, you might find that there's no place to put it, because it's completely impaired in terms of drainage, in terms of damming. And so you'll see areas that don't score very highly on the reference gauges, and also are not considered a priority for a new reference gauge, because there's nowhere to put one, essentially. There's canals. But you can see the areas that are deemed high priority, no surprise, or out in the desert, and areas where you don't see a lot of gauges. Those are the highest priority areas. And so we'd like to get some desert gauges in and some new reference gauges to cover those areas. I think I need to switch these slides around, so this is a good run through. Yeah, well distributed spatially and cover the full range of hydrologic, climate, and local weather conditions. So move this one out. All right, so these are the results, and this is us mashing all of these data sets together and getting a score. And individually, they kind of make sense. Ecosystem is showing the darkest green along the coast in the Sierra Nevada. You can see where the water quality monitoring sites are. You can see where the water supply problems are, which has a lot of groundwater. So Central Valley and Russian River, flood and fire. You see the really bright red dots, those are associated with the dams. And then along the mountains, you can see that the fire hazard, and then the reference gauge score. However, when we put everything in one model, it kind of just smears everything out. It's not very interesting. It doesn't, to me, seem very meaningful. And so combining all of these together into one model was not considered the best way of doing it. So and part of the reason has to do with the data. You're all kind of data folks. So you look at these different data sets, you can see, and they have very different shapes. Like, ecosystem has a really big spike around 0.25. Water supply is more spread out. There's a lot of zeros, right? A lot of zero values. But even when you get rid of the zeros, you still see really different shapes. Like, they have very different distributions. They have very different means, very different medians. And so, to me, that combining these together isn't super meaningful. So instead, here's the question everybody wants to know: is my watershed getting a gauge? Instead, what we decided to do was combine everything into, we looked at the top 200 watersheds in each of the 5 categories. So the top 200 ecosystem watersheds, the top 200 water supply watersheds, the top 200 water quality watersheds, the top 200 reference watersheds, and so on. And we mapped them out like this. We also looked at multi-benefit, and I have a simplified version of this I can show you later. But ultimately, of the you know, in theory, you have up to 1,000 watersheds because it's 200 times 5. We really have 921 because of overlap. And we only have 87 watersheds that scored in the top 200 in more than one category. So most of them really only serve one category and not the rest. And that's what we were seeing when everything was smearing out, was that, you know, you were getting a lot of sort of mediocre scores overall. But there are some clear winners when you look at each category on its own. And here's what it looks like. You know, a little bit of zoom in. I was at SRF 2 weeks ago, and so I kind of zoomed into the area around Santa Cruz, and you can kind of see, you know, there's a lot of overlap in different areas. The darker red are multi-benefit watersheds, so they are occurring down near Santa Cruz, up near Santa Rosa. By the way, these plus signs mean multi-benefit, and I have simplified this so that it's just one category because I decided I didn't like that. But anything that's got a plus is a multi-benefit watershed. You're not seeing a lot. Anything that's red. So the other thing about this analysis is it does not include every consideration and does not supersede local knowledge. This is a statewide data science project. We did our best with the data that were out there, but we did not consider, is there a good spot for a gauge for the most part in terms of road access? I mean, we did a little bit of that, but not really. And of course, you know, what we're really hoping to get is kind of a big picture view as to where you might need a gauge. You know, we could say, hey, you know, the North Coast or the Central Coast or Southern California needs 50 gauges, and our list may not be exactly correct. And so we hope that at least it will support the funding and it will sort of highlight the need. And if the gauge belongs somewhere else, then, you know, that's probably okay. And so these are what the results look like. The other thing we did is we did recommend some gauge upgrades and reactivations. And this is a little out of order, but in terms of the gauge upgrade and reactivations, this question came up. We are considering gauge history as one of the criteria. If a gauge has a really short history, it does not look like a priority. Again, we also looked at spatial marginal benefit, and then we combined that with its watershed ranking, right? So high scoring gauges that were in operation for 25 years and cover 25% of a watershed. If they are in a watershed with a high raw ranking, then they're gonna float to the top. Even if there's other gauges in that watershed, because that seems like, you know, you can have more than one gauge in a watershed, that's okay. Gauges that had that kind of history and benefit that were in watersheds that just didn't score very highly are generally not being recommended. Gauges that had poor history or that cover a very small area, even if they're in a high ranking watershed, they're generally not recommended. So it just depends. So that was considered. We did look at underrepresented communities. Mostly we looked at our analysis to see how it matched with what they call disadvantaged communities. From DWR has a tool called the DAC mapping tool. And we looked at our priorities, and we looked at all of the HUC 12s. And what we found was that our priorities were slightly more likely to have DACs than not. So 31% of the priority watersheds are disadvantaged communities. And for all HUC 12s, that number is 24%. So there's probably more, again, we could do with this, but this was what we had time for. And, you know, it would be interesting to see this, you know, change in the future. Okay, so I'm just going to pivot a little bit here to some of the other chapters, just really briefly. We talked about modernization was basically defined as standard modern technologies, basically updating software and hardware and adding sensors was part of the discussion. And then the other thing that is discussed in the report are sort of what we call emerging technologies. You know, automatic discharge measurements, drones, wireless sensor networks, where you could put out a whole bunch of really cheap gauges that self-organize. And then, you know, they're not going to give you everything you want. They're going to give you stage, but maybe that's what you need. Maybe you need to know if the river is dry or wet. Maybe you don't care how many CFS it is exactly. And then the other thing that was considered emerging technology is machine learning. So this was to augment the existing gauge networks to get more insight on ungauged watersheds. In terms of data management, you know, just doing the gauge inventory was problematic. And the other thing we realized too is that there are lots of gauges out there that are not being counted in our inventory. Stream gauge data in California are collected by dozens of different entities for various purposes of variable quality. But right now, it would be really hard to put all of those those data in the same database, because we don't really have any quality control or quality assurance processes. There's no standard data formats. There's no standardized metadata. Even USGS and DWR use completely different data formats and data metadata. A lot of that data is not accessible in a public database. Some of it is, but not all of it. At the same time, I think there's a lot of value in those gauges. And so one of the things that we recognize is that these small project, or what I call limited resource data, is very useful and should be supported and shared. Like, there should be a way for the state to support those. Very briefly, we do have a chapter on this. We are sort of starting with the Internet of Water principles. I'm not going to go through all of that, but if you want to read what the Internet of Water thinks about data, look it up, maybe just Google it. And again, some of the stuff I just talked about, you know, we want our data to sort of be more interoperable, which involves using persistent identifiers, having some kind of repository that either hosts the data or accesses the data in one spot so you can go get it. And also, I think, you know, stream gauge data management should be a public service. We shouldn't be charging people lots of money to host their data. I think we want people to share their data. We don't want to make it a problem. So I think that was another thing. There is a chapter about funding, which sort of estimates costs for gauges, operations, and maintenance. There may not be cost estimates for data management because it's unclear what the strategy would be. Would they build a new database? How would they do this? But it is mentioned in the report to hopefully encourage that idea to be developed further. And I don't think there was a lot of discussion about exact costs for emerging technologies. But again, the report is meant to encourage these technologies to be adopted as we see fit. And of course, we don't know exactly which technology and how much of it we would want in which area. That's an open question. The funding chapter looks at potential operators, basically collaborations. It looks at funding shortfalls and funding sources. You know, take a look at the report if you want more detail. It's not something that I worked on, so I'm going to kind of go through that really quickly. The core recommendations in the report are to integrate third-party gauges. And so, you know, these are the small operators. How do we integrate them into our system? Improve and expand the state's gauging system. So reactivating historical gauging sites, upgrading existing gauges, which includes adding temperature sensors and installing new stream gauges. Improving gauge data quality and management. So this is, again, going back to the integration question and database question. Prioritize stream gauge funding. And this is for not just installing gauges, but for operations and maintenance over the long run. And then to streamline the regulatory permitting. One of the things that came up was that installing a gauge can take a while because of regulatory permitting, and are there ways to make that a little bit easier? The other question, just sort of wrapping this up, how does the existing gauge network look? You know, we have this big prioritization project, and it tells us which watersheds should be the highest priority in the state. And so the question is, how do the gauges look now? And the answer is they look pretty good, actually. 77% overall, or 81% of our what we call active high quality gauges landed in watersheds that either would have been in the top 200 if they didn't have a gauge, or are serving some other purpose, like they're a known forecasting gauge or reference gauge. And I will say that there is substantial overlap, right? Just because there's 225 forecasting gauges, a good number of those were also reference gauges, and a good number of those were also in the top 200. So on their own, it might be 50 extra gauges that were forecasting that didn't score in the top 200. And so our existing gauge network does seem to cover the priorities pretty well, which is great. What we also found was that 74% of those active gauges, active high priority gauges, lack a temperature sensor. Like, we just don't have temperature sensors on most gauging stations. So adding water temperature on the right becomes more of a priority because, you know, this is something that we were asked to look at. And again, this is potentially how we're addressing water quality. Just a real quick graphic to show you how everything else looks. These on the left is the active limited use gauges. You can again see the blue dots are the gauges that are being recommended for a comprehensive upgrade, and then the red dots are gauges that need a water temperature sensor. And then green are just gauges that were high priority and should just be left. They're good. We're good to go. On the right are inactive gauges and their locations, and the blue dots are the ones being recommended for reactivation in the state. quick number count, we are actually recommending 161 reactivations, 48 upgrades, and 432 new gauges. And I think we're also recommending around 550 temperature sensors be added to gauges throughout the state. So that's quite a lot. And then I kind of had a real summary for SRF. You know, 84% of the California watersheds are engaged. Most of the gauges that are there are on main stems and impaired. There are 1,000 gauges in operation. There's between 1,200 and 2,000 plus gauges that have been deactivated, depending on how you count. Small project gauge data, there might be 500 gauges in the state. Should be supported and integrated. We have no idea. Prioritization is complicated. And then, you know, data doesn't always point to the best gauge site, so local knowledge is pretty important. And that's basically it. And this is what the report chapters are going to look like. History, inventory, management, prioritization, modernization, data management, costs, and a summary. So the report, I believe, is going to be coming out any day now. Dan can tell you that in a minute. And I just wanted to open it up to questions. And I can't see everybody in the chat, so I wanted to allow folks to ask questions.
I can help facilitate questions here.
Yeah.
So let's see. I'm echoing on someone. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hmm.
I can hear you.
Can everybody please mute? Okay, let's try this again. Hopefully no echo. All right. So it looks like there was a comment from Amanda in the chat that could also incorporate NWI layers here. I'm not entirely sure what slide that was on. Amanda, did you want to add anything? You may be on mute if you are trying to talk. We can always circle back to you. Also, comments about the presentation, about getting a copy of the presentation, and we will be sharing a presentation, just give a couple more updates. We are targeting getting the draft technical report out within the next couple days, even as soon as maybe this afternoon, if things go right with our final cleanups. So if you're, and I'll send the notice out to this email subscription list as well as our SB19 stream gauging email list. We're targeting having it out. The comment period will be short, but we have a very short turnaround. We're trying to complete this report by the end of June. So the comment period will probably be closing on May 31st for any public comments that people may have or recommendations. And we're tentatively scheduled our public outreach meeting for next Thursday on the 19th. So all of those announcements will come out when we release the report. And what we'll probably do with the presentation is just so we don't have too many different ones floating around, is we'll probably just post the public version of this presentation, the one for the public meeting, which will have more detail than this, on our website, and I dropped a link in chat. So let's see here. And then there's a question from Regina. What spatial interpolation did you use? Kriging or natural neighbor? I'm not sure. Again, some of these came in the middle of the presentation, so I'm not sure which portion of the presentation they're referring to.
Yeah, right there, that blues. If you move down, Val. Oh, great presentation, by the way. Really enjoyed it. And I guess I would suggest slide numbers for just in case someone wants to reference kind of like what we're doing now. Go ahead and slide down a little bit. That one combined with the ref, the 3, 2, 1. Was that just Huck, or was that actually a spatial interpolation that you used? Slide 26. Looks like, yeah. Oh, Val, you're on mute.
This was, we assigned one score for each HUC 12 for each area, and then we just added them together and multiply. So we added all of the, we just, you know, we added basically all of these together. Each of these had a score from adding their input layers. And then to get to, you know, adding these 5 together gives you one score, and then multiplying it by the gauge gap. The gauge gap also had a number between 0 and 1. So that was a multiplication, and that's how you got that number. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Really
so
clear?
for all those other ones, the flood area ecosystem, is that all spatial interpolation, or is that also based on HUC 12?
It's all based on HUC 12.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's not constant. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And Carl had a question on what the average cost would be to put in a new gauge. I don't know if you have that off the top of your head.
No, it's around $30,000, I think. No, it depends. It depends on how fancy your gauge is. Really, there are levels of gauges, and the base level gauge, which is, it does have telemetry and I think and a temperature sensor, and is flow rated, is about $30,000 to install it, and then $30,000 a year to maintain it. Because they have to go out and take flow measurements. That's a big part of the cost, or sort of personnel. You can spend $200,000 on a new gauge if it's, you know, if it's a high tech fancy gauge with lots and lots of sensors. But most of the gauges, I think, are about 30,000.
Thank you, Val. It's an excellent presentation.
All right. So in chat here, Amanda responded that the NWI is a wetlands mapper for a wetland layer.
Okay. All right, we'll look at that.
For consideration, yeah, and she dropped a link in there. So really quick here, and then I'll switch over to people once I get caught up on the chat here. Sherry mentioned looking for information on how to join and or share information on the public meeting. We have not released the public meeting date. That will come out when we release the document, hopefully tomorrow at the latest. And it will have all the meeting joining info and so on and so forth as part of that announcement. So stay tuned for that. Again, that will come out, that announcement. I'll send it to everybody on this email subscription list, and then also our standard stream gauging list. Also have a question here from Angela. Does higher score mean higher priority?
Yes. Sorry.
I think I just missed it. Thank you. Hi, Val.
Hi.
All right, moving over to our folks with their hands raised. I will start with Nick.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I appreciate addressing the gap in gauging we have. Kind of tying to Aaron's presentation where the WCB funds projects that sometimes install gauging. Is there any way to incentivize that the gauging data be made public?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I think in general that probably should be encouraged. We do want anybody that's receiving state funds to be sharing their data. Having said that, I will acknowledge that there are some sensitive issues around landowners and restoration and relationships in watersheds, and I'm not sure that mandating it is the right way to go without thinking about it very carefully, and potentially allowing exemptions. And I know there are a lot of watersheds where folks are doing really good work, and if they were required to share their gauge data, that people might kick them off the land, and that might be counterproductive, I think, for the objectives of restoration and ecosystem protection. So we have to think about that carefully.
Yeah, our broad recommendation is that folks that are receiving public funds should make that data publicly available, and we're trying to figure out how best to push that information to like CDEC or something else. You know, and like Val was saying, that there'll be some exceptions to that, so it's not right, thou shall type thing.
I believe FERC projects, as they come up for relicensing, are required to share their data. So in some cases, there is already some mandates to make PG&E or whoever is operating the reservoir to make the, because they tend to have gauges. They're just not on CDEC. So
next up is Julie.
Hi, thanks for that presentation. That was great. I just wanted to really, this is more of a comment. I wanted to make the point that what we're doing in SEF, a lot of it is trying to predict, natural flows, and now we have this new effort I mentioned earlier where we're trying to predict actual flows as a way to fill in the gaps among gauges, and having this really good reference gauge network is crucial for that, the natural flows modeling, and then the actual flows we're also relying on the gauge network. So I think, you mentioned it in your emerging technologies, but just we're going to have to develop these modeling processes to get data in places where we don't have gauges, right? Because we're never going to be able to gauge everywhere, and adding gauges in kind of enough different places so we can capture that variability to inform the models is just another use, I think, that hasn't really been thought of as kind of a separate use case, maybe. So just wanted to put that out there that, we were really relying on having this gauge network and really being able to inform the modeling results. So thanks.
yeah, and I think there's potential to, again, all of this is written in R code. So these analyses could be rerun later if we decide we want to run a different reference gauge list, or that the reference gauge pairing isn't exactly right and you want to tweak it or change the data sets out. This is something that we can do pretty quickly these days. So Julie, if that's something that's interesting to you, if you have priorities for your modeling, let us know and we'll see what we can do if that's helpful to you.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Conrad.
Hi, great presentation. Thank you. Just one comment and then one question. Comment is about negotiating with landowners. I'm a landowner and also a water right holder, and also an advocate for the rights of non-humans and future generations. I would encourage the water board to do a lot more negotiating at the outset before money is spent on private land. I think we need to start demanding things, and I know Daniel said that's the suggestion. So I would just say do as much as possible to demand that data, require that data is public. Landowners are getting tons of money for things that increase the value of their land. Also, the law says the river should have enough water for fish not to go extinct. So I know it's sensitive for landowners, but what is more sensitive is the fact that salmon are going extinct, and that's sensitive for the people who were here first and for a lot of us. So it's sensitive on both sides, but for some reason we always focus more on the landowner sensitivity. The one question you mentioned, temperature gauges, would it cost a lot to go back to existing gauges and add temperature, or just make it part of the protocol? And then same question for dissolved oxygen.
I was told that it's about 10 grand a gauge to add temperature. And so we are recommending that 77%, I think, of existing gauges get a temperature sensor. So like that's over 500 gauges. So yeah, I think it should be part of the protocol, and certainly for new gauges, it will be something.
Okay, and I've had these little things in my creek by my house that do DO and temperature and a few other things. Like, is there, I don't know, is it more expensive to do each and every one, or could you, like DO, couldn't you accomplish DO for about the same amount of money or less?
Yeah, I think so. DO is a little different because there's some calibration. Like the temperature sensors are pretty easy. You plop them in the stream and they generally work. DO, I think you have to take them to the lab and calibrate them, and so it's slightly more complicated. I will say that maybe this is something I should make more explicit. My definition of stream gauges was flow and stage, because, and that's why we were able to use water quality stations as an input to the data layer, because there are other gauges that are not measuring flow and stage. They are measuring temperature and DO, but they are not measuring amounts of water or levels. And so I think that's a different analysis. I think deciding how many more temperature and DO sensors and other kind of water quality sensors need to be there is its own project in its own right, and probably should be addressed, and maybe is going to be addressed in the near future. But we didn't really cover that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add that in our conversations with water resources, and it's in the report as well, the costs sometimes vary to add temperature or dissolved oxygen or other water quality parameters, because it depends on what's actually there. So it might make more sense, instead of just adding, additional collecting sensors, it might make sense to replace the entire sensor altogether. That then comes with those other components as part of it, because it's just in need of its outdated equipment. So there's some cost variables, and then of course, as Valerie mentioned at the beginning, this is just kind of the plan to hopefully start to look at funding for these different prioritizations. So there's not funding available yet to do these things. They're just, this is what we see as the next step for the state.
Thanks, you guys.
Yep. So let's see, next up is a song.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, so for this sort of putting in new gauges and data sensors and networking it into real-time based, telemetry system is nice. I was wondering when you on these large network coverages of whether it will be new, I guess mostly new gauges, have you considered the I guess telemetry would be done through using a cell tower unless it is a satellite link. How the cell phones, like basically signal coverages, would be factored into this. And second one will be how easy in terms of human access to these either proposed locations or already existing locations to verify or develop and verify the rating curves on the gauges would be nice. Just want to add the previous comments about the dissolved oxygen sensors. And these days we have better they call it luminescent DO cells, or it's more better than the old clock cell based DO sensors. So it might be useful in some of those strategic locations or the important locations, placing some of these DO sensors as it still has to be serviced and then calibrated, but that would be another factor that can be added into your determination of where and what locations some of these either upgrade to or adding to sensors, or the putting into new gauging locations. So sorry for multiple comments and questions, but
yeah, like I said, the costing really had like this huge range. Like, oh, this is how much it would cost if it was easy, and this is if you have to replace all of these things, or there's no cell phone coverage and we have to go to satellite. Yeah, I mean, when I'm giving you a number, it's really just somewhere in the middle that I was given. And you're right, there may be stuff that we've tagged as a priority where there are no bridges, there are no roads, we just can't get in there, and that's not going to be a good watershed for a gauge. That's definitely going to be the case for some of these watersheds, for sure.
Yeah, I was basically thinking some of those factors, like a cell coverage and then access, would be could be factored into your determination of the whole process. And obviously, you talked about the human cost, and could be actually dangerous to get into some of the locations unless you rappel down to the creek bottom to get the measurements, which I've done a few times, which is not fun a lot of times. Well, risking your, not the life, but risking your hand or foot, I guess. Anyway, thanks.
All right, next up is Dan.
Hello, my name is Dan Grigg. I'm with Sierra Hydrographics. That was a great presentation, Valerie, and wanted to know how, as a business, I heard some of the numbers you were kind of throwing out there, and you're right about the discrepancies on how much a gauge could cost depending on location. But I was wondering, when these eventually come out, will they go through Cal procurement or Cal bid? Because we think as a private industry that we could do a really good job out there and actually save some costs over entities like the USGS and things like that.
Yeah, I would say we're not that far along in the project. How the funding actually happens is pretty unclear. I think, a lot of these numbers are coming from DWR. who are assumed to be the primary entity for gauging. But as we talked about earlier, some of this could be coming out from WCB funds. Like we could be funding smaller projects. We could be, the State Water Board has a few gauges that are here and there, and so it's actually unclear as to how funding will get distributed in the future. And of course, that would then lead into how they end up hiring folks to do gauging. So I would say I don't know. It's a little too early, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. And also, we run approximately 150 meteorological and surface gauging station. Do you want me to email you on the sites that we maintain so you could add them to your database?
I would say, yeah, we were kind of, compiling an inventory of third party really informally. We didn't have time to really complete it, but I am keeping a list of what's out there. I would like to know what's out there in case we take this further, for sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, so a couple of things on that one. The report identifies potential funding sources, but not, how those funds would be spent or where they would be spent. So that's kind of more of a site-specific or grant application type of analysis. And then the second part is we recognize this need to better incorporate the existing third-party gauges from willing partners into CDEC and kind of establish a little bit stronger O&M type of rules so that it's more clear what that data represents. That's also something that is a recommendation for the next step, because that's part of that is upgrades to CDEC itself. So more to come on that. We kind of envision this as kind of an ongoing effort and kind of a living document. And then, as Valerie mentioned, with the fact that it's all in R, we can add gauges as gauges get put in and redo some of the gauge gap analyses and stuff like that once we have that information. So next question is Alan.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks for the presentation. I did get to see Julie and Ted at the SRF conference, and their presentations was fantastic as well. It really got me inspired to look at how I can do more of this type of effort on Butte Creek. And I just, as a real lay person in this whole thing, I mean, a lot of these statistics were way over my head, but I get the gist of all of this and wondering how we can start incorporating some of the traditional knowledge, as you mentioned, from our watersheds into the prioritization of these gauging efforts. Butte Creek has quite a few gauges that are operating on a regular basis. Some have been taken offline over the last 20 years or so, but we're starting to understand that we need much better gauging to really understand our surface to groundwater dynamics, and most importantly, to manage the stream flow for salmonid species in Butte Creek. So I actually have to jump onto another call right now. I apologize.
There's plates right there.
I'm wondering if we could talk about how we can get our prioritization into the mix. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I would love to have a conversation about that. So send us an email, Byron.
It's on the other, not being right on.
He's still there. Okay.
So plates there. This is rice and chicken that I made a long time ago. Nice. If you don't like it, I don't care. I'm also making these sandwiches. There's 3 ready to go, and then yes, for
Sounds like lunchtime, y'all.
yeah.
Mute.
Yeah. But make sure you like that before you invest in it. Oh, I'm sure it's fine.
Dan, you're muted.
Thank you. Any other
Yes,
questions or comments?
You might want to start over about 30 seconds back.
Yeah, I was just asking if anybody had any additional questions or comments on this.
Well, actually, I do
Hearing
have,
none.
but sorry, this is one song. I was wondering so in terms of the value you talked about, each station would cost about $30,000 to set it up, and operating will be another 30 a year. Is it possible that you can also, depending on the priority or depending on the access and things like that, you can just deploy or the strategy in terms of, and then that the priority will be stratified, and then also if you can actually allocate smaller amount for that one location or one or a few locations, that with the sort of a cheaper version of loggers, depth loggers and barometric pressure loggers, that would give you, say a data logging capacity for a month, and then retrieve it back, so you don't have to risk it, once a week or so, or and then it doesn't have to be telemetered either, so you can just retrieve the data and then at on site and set it out again, and that could be another strategy. And you can set it up. I would say, one logger costs about, I would say about $300-400, and you combine it with the barometric pressure, that give you, even maybe less than 1,000 or 1,500. That could be set up for, at least for the flow gauging. Not sure about the depth gauge, not the maybe not the flow, that could be determined later, and further with the further development of rating curves. So it could be another way of handling it.
Yeah, I mean, if we're not doing flow rating, your operation costs go down. That's pretty clear. And there are very good sensors that are very cheap. And that is part of the reason we want to support small project data. And so, yeah, $30,000 is the standard, USGS flow rated high quality gauge number. But you're absolutely right that there could be a lot of information that we can get without having a flow rated gauge that maybe not running year round, or maybe some of these emerging technologies could help with that. Especially the ones with automatic velocity sensors on site, that kind of thing. I mean, they might be expensive to put in, but in the long run, it might be cheaper because you don't have to go out there every month and take a flow measurement. So that could make a big difference in cost.
Yeah, or use a citizen scientist, send it out with a couple of oranges and throw it out and get the velocity measurements, and then also the cross sections, and that would be it.
Yep. For sure.
All right. Well, thank you, Val, for presenting today. And yeah, so keep your eyes out for the release of the draft technical document later this week. Next up on the agenda is just a round robin of any drought updates that anybody might have. I can go ahead and kick it off. We are moving towards readopting the Russian River Emergency Regulation. I don't think that there is a firm board meeting date selected yet. It's the next board meeting in May, which, let me look at the calendar here, which would be next Tuesday or potentially the first week of June. Part of the uncertainty there is that one of the components of the regulation that is getting some traction is a voluntary water sharing program that folks would be able to sign up for, and that's currently out for public review and comment. It would be led by, we're hosting it and helping to, the water board is hosting it on their webpage, and also hoping to facilitate the voluntary agreement. It would be something that could be done in lieu of curtailments under the regulation. The benefit to more of a water sharing program is water rights is pretty rigid, so it doesn't take into account opportunities to reduce water and share water amongst users, and this would kind of provide a framework for meeting more people's needs. So it's not a you're either on or you're off type thing, but it's more of a scalable reduction depending on your priority of right. And I can drop a link to that webpage in the chat if people are interested in taking a look at it. So that's my update on the Russian River. I don't know, do we have any other water rights staff on that can speak to any of the other emergency regulations? Any updates? All right, I'm not hearing anybody. How about any other agencies or anybody else have any drought updates they want to share?
I thought Anne Marie Orr might step on to talk about the Shasta Scott.
It looks like she had to drop off probably at noon. I don't see her in the meeting anymore. I was thinking the same, but
it
no
appears
longer listed.
The water board will likely extend those emergency regs for another year as well. They
Yep.
just had the first
We
public
are,
meeting.
yeah, that is correct. We are looking to, with all of our emergency regulations right now, they're all being considered for renewal. They stay in place for 1 year. And I think the Bay Delta one is also moving towards renewal as well. I thought I saw a notice come out on that as well. It looks like, hold on one second. Julie has her hand up.
Hi, yeah, I just thought I would share that we've been putting together something that we're calling we keep changing the name, the Natural Flows Drought Monitor, where we're taking the monthly predictions of natural flows data and looking for any given month and year, how that relates to the distribution of flows for that same month over the period of record. And now we've extended the modeling of those monthly flows up to current. So we just released the April of this year predictions. Kurt Klossmeyer, who works with me, has been developing a Tableau site for this, and then we're going to add it as part of the Natural Flows web app. So it's summarized by kind of larger watersheds, so you can go into the tool and look for any month and year kind of where the drought effects are predicted to be highest with respect to natural flows. So any human use would be on top of that, but you know, it's one tool to kind of assess conditions, and you can compare between years and different months. Can I put the URL? Yeah, we are still working on making it kind of user-friendly. I think I can share I need to find the URL to the Tableau site, like it's still getting up and running. I will share that with Dan and maybe he can send that out to the group. It will eventually transition over to the Natural Flows web tool, but that will take us a few more months to get that done.
Yeah, I'll send that out once I get it, Julie.
Okay, great. Sorry, I was just responding to a comment I saw in the chat. So
yeah, no, I thought too.
Thanks.
Any other updates? Thank you, Julie. All right, I'm not hearing any, so that will bring our meeting to a close. So our next meeting looks like it will be August 9th. So as always, you know, feel free to send me any potential topics that you think would be good to discuss. If you know of or think of some presentations or guest speakers that you think would be good to have come, please let me know that as well. It's very helpful if you know of a guest speaker that you would like to have come to the meeting. It's very helpful if you help organize getting that speaker here for me. Since with the drought and stuff going on, my time is a little bit limited to really put into to contacting people and getting these agendas built out. So any help there would be greatly appreciated. Any other closing comments or thoughts? All right, well, thank you everybody for joining today, and we will send a follow-up email in the next week or so with presentations and a link to the recording for anybody that missed it. Well, obviously you're all here, but for anybody you know that might want to see this meeting. And have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Thank you.